Today, we will swap our white Toyota for this beautiful black Land Rover, and with good reason. We want to go into the dunes, in the really sandy dunes. I was promised dunes by the sea, seals and flamingos. I'm curious to see whether today can hold its word. Later, it will also be about the topic of time lapses. In the meantime, we drove further north from the Dead Flay to the sea and set up camp in the Delight Hotel in Swakopmunde. From there, we drive past Wolfish Bay back into the Namib-Naukluft National Park. Unlike in Sossusvlei, where the sand has more red and orange tones, bright yellow dunes dominate here, which border directly on the Atlantic. Large seal colonies live here with no real enemies. Large swarms of pelicans and flamingos can also be photographed here. Since the border between photography and film is getting blurred when it comes to time-lapse, it is time to hand the word over to our cameraman, Stephanas Kleinas.
Time-lapse is the first step towards creating moving images. What is a time-lapse? A time-lapse is a combination of 25 frames per second, which I can then play in a timeline, essentially a film. Today, I would like to show you a few aspects to tell you how you can shoot a time-lapse and how you can improve it even more. First question, what is a time-lapse for? A time-lapse is there to show a change over a period of time. For example, we can show this landscape behind me in the background at sunset. We can do this simply from the top of a tripod. We can put a camera on top and see the change happening. But we can also upgrade the whole time-lapse a bit by putting it on a camera slider, for example. The camera will move over the period and give the whole thing a completely different level of depth and movement. The second question we have to ask ourselves in the whole subject of time-lapse is, what do I actually need to make a time-lapse? The first thing I just mentioned is the tripod. That's mandatory. We have to make sure that the camera is as stable as possible, because every bit of shake will destroy our time-lapse. The second thing, again mandatory, we have to make sure that we have enough power for the camera to cover the period and that the memory card will have enough space. In other words, we want to avoid that the time-lapse suddenly stops in the middle and we don't get the sunset. Then we need a so-called intervalometer. This is a small device that tells the camera to take a picture every 5 seconds. We then have to prepare the camera so that it can take a time-lapse. That means focus on manual. We want to avoid the camera looking for a new focus point for each picture. Image stabilization off, because otherwise every image would be stabilized differently by the camera. And then we can adjust the exposure. For example, we can set the exposure to manual. This means that we just use one specific exposure and the change in light can present itself over time. Or we can go to the aperture, program or ISO automatic mode, which we can use to show how the scenery changes in the light. We will always have a perfect exposure, but we will show how the light changes as a result. You may recognize this from the time-lapse where we start with the sun and end with the stars. Other aspects that we have to look at when we are doing time-lapse is the question, do we have shaky elements in the foreground? Things like these shrubs. If they wiggle in the wind with short exposure times, it looks totally uneasy and we don't want to have that in the time-lapse because it just doesn't give us a nice shot. The last question I have to ask myself is, how many pictures do I want to take? And how long do I actually want to have the sequence? This allows you to calculate how many photos you have to take and at what intervals you have to take them. We have a recommendation for everyone who wants to dig into the topic even more intensively. Guntherio Wegnerio, our partner of the Color Class Namibia, has launched a new ebook in which he covers the topic and explains everything about time-lapse in detail. Gunther has also been to Africa and contributed some of the time-lapse footage for this episode. Take a look at his films on his website.
On the coast, we saw some large animals like seals, flamingos and pelicans. The desert, however, seemed rather dead. The living desert tour through the Dorob National Park, bordering Swakopmunde to the east should show us how wrong we were. Without the trained eye of our guide Chris, we would have simply overlooked countless animals. Here, for example, this sensationally well-camouflaged Namibian viper, also known as a sidewinder snake. We would never have found this shovel-snouted lizard without Chris's help. We apologized for the disruption with a few mealworms. A hole in the ground is enough for Chris to find us this colorful Namib dune gecko. In order to leave as few traces as possible in the desert, we continue on in a single line to find a very old chameleon that is said to live nearby.